It's nice to have this discussion in New York City, representing the three most important journalistic institutions in the metropolis: the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Claremont Review of Books. As Brian boasted, your speakers have in common tonight a connection to the Claremont Institute. You've got two Publius Fellows and one Lincoln Fellow. And in case you're wondering which organization is most influential, may I point out that Claremont has people at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, but the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times do not have any people at Claremont. Speaking of selectivity, there is a fourth institution represented tonight besides these three journals and implicitly the Claremont Institute, and that's Harvard. You may have noticed a crimson theme to the surroundings here at the Harvard Club. We are all products of Harvard, as Brian noted. Ross and I were among the Harvard undergraduates, not the same year as you might have assumed from our appearance. Another difference is that I had the good grace not to write a book about my experience at Harvard. Ross did, and actually he wrote a very good book about that experience. He has now, in fact, written books about God, man, and Harvard, which somehow can't match the anticlimax of God, man, and Yale. Henry Adams, a Harvard man too, joked that the transition from President George Washington to President Ulysses S. Grant was sufficient evidence to refute Darwin's theory of evolution. I have my own version of that refutation. This weekend, I celebrate my 35th Harvard reunion. At my commencement on a rainy day in 1978, the speaker was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Tomorrow, at Harvard's 362nd commencement, the speaker is Oprah Winfrey. So much for natural selection. Now, the title of tonight's discussion is Saving the Constitution, Conservatism's Prospects. And the title combines, I think, two ideas. That whatever else may determine conservatism's prospects politically and intellectually, saving the Constitution and thus saving our free government ought to be high on the list of conservative desiderata, a required course, so to speak, not an elective. After the 2012 election, conservatism is, I think we would all admit, down, but not, I think, out. As elections go, it was not a landslide. Speaking as a Californian, it was about a 4.6 on the political Richter scale. Measured against all presidential contests since 1896, when political scientists usually think that modern politics began, that's 30 presidential contests in all. President Obama's victory margin in the Electoral College was only 22nd out of the 30 presidential contests. His percentage of the popular vote, 18 out of 30. Quite ordinary numbers. But numbers, of course, don't tell the whole story. His victory was good enough to enable him to argue that 2012 was a confirming election, proving the voters' enduring support for the strong shift to the left that he had begun in 2008. Now, as a matter of political science, that claim is highly dubious. His percentage of the popular vote declined from his first election in 2008, when he got almost 53% of the popular vote. He barely broke 51% the second time around. That is highly unusual among presidential re-elections. And of course, the House of Representatives remained in Republican hands. The GOP picked up a governorship and maintained a majority control of a majority of the state houses in the country. And so there is plenty of evidence that when the American people came, in Yogi Berra's immortal phrase, to a fork in the road, they took it. Rather than forward, the slogan under which President Obama conducted his reelection campaign, the voters seem to be saying sideways. But of course, the stakes of the long-term political battle couldn't be higher. It's not simply policies that are at stake in our contemporary politics, important as they are, and I think few policies are as important to the future of the country as Obamacare. But there are also, I would argue, regime questions at stake. How shall we govern ourselves? Shall we govern ourselves? Or resign ourselves to a government, a powerful and centralized government of so-called experts in a very distant capital? Conservatism has always been about this issue, that is, the fate of the republic, whatever else it may have been about in the long 20th century history of its evolution and late in the century, its political triumphs. Conservatism has always been about this issue because liberalism, modern liberalism, has always been about offering us a series of early Roman emperors, so to speak, who have noticed the obsolescence of the old republic and who have set out gradually to supplant it with a new republic, better and more expertly led, constantly evolving, and frightfully generous with other people's money. You may think I exaggerate, and I do. But when Adolf Burley, one of the principal New Deal brains trusters, wrote to his boss, Franklin Roosevelt, he always addressed his letters, "Dear Caesar." The liberal idea is to replace the old limited constitution with a new one, euphemistically termed living. The important thing to understand about the liberal proposition is that the living constitution is not a restraint on government. It is government. That is, it is the sum total of all the agencies, programs, and practices through which we govern ourselves, or increasingly by which we are ruled. All of these new programs, the aspects of unlimited government in our time, are argued for and established in the name of justice, a peculiar new kind of individual rights, which Franklin Roosevelt famously referred to as the Second Bill of Rights. These are rights to things like a job, a vacation from the job, health care, a decent home, and so forth, socioeconomic benefits, basically, of one kind or another. All of these rights are a new kind of individual right, much too precious to be trusted to individuals. And this is basically the character of the new rights doctrines, the new account of justice in our politics. Rights are an important thing still of the liberal dispensation, but these are rights that the individual is not competent to assert himself. They are rights that must be granted to him because of that incompetence, must be protected from him, and whose exercise must increasingly be guided by government rather than being a bulwark against government. So, as we, in a way, saw in the recent Obamacare decision in the Supreme Court, modern liberal government can't be unconstitutional because it is the Constitution. It is one designed not to separate, limit, and check powers, as the old one was, but to concentrate them in the hands of people who take contemporary Harvard education much too seriously, and who are therefore qualified to do good for us and to us, good and hard, even without the consent of the governed or the consent of our representatives. The modern regulatory state or administrative state has increasingly this character of conducting business out of sight of the people and of the people's representatives, making laws called regulations in the name of the people and their representatives, though hardly responsible to them in any real way. The IRS scandals are simply the latest exhibit of the unregulated character of the regulators, of the fact that much of our liberty exists now at the sufferance of government, and the sufferance particularly of unelected officials in government. And the problem has gotten worse as liberalism has matured. The old New Deal style regulatory agencies, I would point out, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, were governed by a commission, which had usually 5 members on it, at most 3 from the governing party, from the president's party. And so they were run in a bipartisan way and in a quasi-legislative way. You had to have a majority of the commissioners vote for a regulation in order for it to be issued. But in its wisdom, liberalism moved away from that model, saw the limitations of that model in terms of growing government and keeping government responsible. And so beginning in the 1970s, began to create new kinds of administrative agencies that were not run by commission, but by a single administrator, whose word alone was enough to issue a regulation. The Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, very much of the bureaucracy being set up now to run Obamacare. All of these are single administrator agencies where the vestige of legislative control has been almost entirely given up. These are top-down, expert-led agencies where one person's voice is enough now to make law in this country. The propositions I would put before you tonight are simple to state, but not at all simple to follow out. We cannot completely reverse the effects of a century of modern liberalism, certainly not in, I think, a reasonable amount of time. But what we can do is 3 things. We can call a halt to further injuries to the Constitution, that we have violated the separation of powers, that we have injured federalism, that we have committed many unjust and unwise acts so far, ought not to be a reason to commit more in the future. Secondly, we can constitutionalize as much as possible of current government. We can do small things like try to go back to commission-run bureaucratic agencies rather than single administrator-run ones. We can, it is possible to tell regulatory agencies, issue no more regulations for a certain time. Why don't we have a pause in our regulatory activities? That's a completely constitutional thing to ask. Why don't we put a stop to delegations, unconstitutional delegations of legislative power to these unelected officials as much as possible? Certainly, Obamacare alone offers an enormous agenda of reform in that direction. But third, and perhaps most important of all, we need to remind citizens that free government is not permanent, that it can't be taken for granted, that it can be lost. Without a Republican government anchored in the Constitution, all of the other things, all good things that Republicans and conservatives are calling for, economic growth, lower taxes, stronger families, fewer abortions, balanced budgets, reduced federal debt, all of these things will avail us very little if we lose the form of our government, if we lose the limits on our government, if we lose self-government, which is, I think, the ultimate stake in this fight between conservatism and liberalism today. Thank you.